Bradley Schurman joins us from Washington, D.C. He is the author of The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, as well as the founder and CEO of Super Age, a global research and advisory firm that counsels clients on workforce recruitment and retention, inclusive design, and marketing and communication strategies. Bradley is an expert on demographic change and how it disrupts social, cultural, political, and economic norms across the U.S. and around the world. He has written for Newsweek, been quoted by Esquire, Car and Driver, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and USA Today. He joins us today to discuss his thoughts on the seismic changes in demography that are affecting the future of our economies here in the U.S. and around the world, as well as our society at large. And with that, I welcome Bradley to the program.
Hey, Brian, how are you?
Great. Thanks for taking time to join us this week.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's begin with the title of your book and the term the super age. What does it refer to? Why is it important?
It's important for all of us, regardless of our geographic position, because the United States, as well as many developed nations, are moving into a period called the super age, where at least 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65. This is radically transforming economies around the world. It's shifting our political norms. And it's changing the way businesses have to consider clients and workforce now and for the foreseeable future.
So let's talk about, there's so many places we can talk about with this. And I think I want to begin with the geopolitics of it, because if we think about the biggest implication overall of demographic shifts around the world, it tends to show up in sometimes unexpected ways. Let's start here at home for those of us who are living and recording here in the United States, here in the US. When we think about our population and how it is changing versus the rest of the world, what are some of the unique changes? We mentioned the over 65. Are there other elements of demographic change here in the US that are particularly important for us to consider in our place in the world?
Yeah, so there are really kind of 3 things that you need to look out for as it relates to demographic change: birth rates, extension and longevity, essentially the aging of society, and then depopulation. So 3 things that we're always looking out for. And they're signals for the overall economic, social, and political health of a nation, a region, even a locality. In the United States, it's really important to pay attention to this because at least 6 states now have reached the super age designation, where at least 1 out of 5 people are over 65. But more importantly, it's also really essential that individuals across this nation realize that 3/4 of our counties and half of our states now have deaths outpacing births. Meaning that without immigration, that one sticky issue here in this country right now, without immigration, we would be in population decline in many parts of this country.
Are there particular reasons why this is happening now? And is this something that the US or countries like us have had in the past?
This is one of the longest term trends that we've been watching, essentially, as long as we've been able to count our populations. We've been counting population change. And in fact, a decrease in birth rates began as early as 1760 with the advent of the first industrial revolution. However, it wasn't until the second industrial revolution in the late 1800s and early 1900s that we really started to see 2 things really change in a big way. The first was birth rates declined at a fairly precipitous rate. The second thing is survival of children actually improved dramatically. Prior to then, it was about 50% chance of survival to adulthood. It jumped to over 90% over the course of the last century. And at the same time, we saw all of these people living longer. So decreased birth rates, increased survival rates, increased longevity led the world to grow from about 2 billion people just 100 years ago to 8 billion people today. That is unheard of in the history of man. In fact, for most of human history, societies have grown at a very, very small, very, very slow rate year on year. Life expectancy on the whole for the planet hovered around 35 for nearly all of humanity's existence. And now the average is closer to 75, 78. In countries in Europe, in Asia, they're pushing over 80. In the US today, we're about 76.
So, as we think about the United States in particular, we mentioned 75%. I want to make sure people heard that. 75% of the counties in the United States have more deaths than births. Now, is there a commonality among these? Are we talking rural counties, suburban, urban counties? Is there any pattern
Yeah.
among
Yeah,
those?
you hit the nail on the head. The commonality amongst nearly all of these is that they're rural counties and rural states. There has been significant outward migration in the rural counties across this country. That's due to a myriad of reasons. We can point to globalization, we can point to automation, we can point to urbanization. Um, it's just really hard to run a farm in this country now. The economics of scale aren't there. So what happened was young uh, men and women who realized there wasn't a future in farming left. The economics of it just weren't there anymore, and they moved into cities or they moved into suburbs adjacent to cities, leaving behind what is a very old population in most of these counties now. Not just old, but also monocultural. They tend to be white, they tend to be Christian, and they're older. And they tend to be more conservative as well. So it's a lot of pieces coming together in one place. But it is something to pay attention to, especially against the body politic, because small states, rural states, do have a significant say in the national discourse.
And as we think about the implications on the economy, we'll start here in the US because I do want to do a little trip around the world, but we'll start here in the US first. When we think about the implications on the economy, we have been told over and over again in the news, we know it's an aging population. We know there's going to be enormous implications of taking care of an aging population. That will have effects on young people, and we don't have as many young people as we would ordinarily need for everything from our social programs like Social Security and Medicare to simply caretaking and being able to take care of people as they're unable to take care of themselves. How big of a problem is this in your view? And what is the implication for the American economy if we don't find a way to deal with this demographic shift?
Okay, let me unpack that into two buckets. First of all, it depends. It depends where you're located. If you are geolocated in an urban area, you're going to be mostly fine, and the older population can mostly be managed in terms of the caregiving issues that you've raised. If you're in a rural county, it's a lot different. The rural counties have seen uh, really shocking reversal of fortune over the past 50 years or so. In fact, most of the services that we consider to be standard in an urban or even a suburban environment just don't exist there anymore. And, I think we can put a pin in like the 1990s when the big box stores moved in to these counties and essentially pushed out a lot of mom and pops. The economy of scale wasn't there anymore for mom and pops to survive. But we saw soon after that the closing of schools or the consolidation of schools. We saw Main Street, further empty out. We saw that hospitals, I mean, the number of hospitals that have closed in the countryside is really shocking. There are no longer health services available for the population that's there and in need. And these aren't really attractive places for immigrants to go necessarily either. So it's not like there's a new workforce coming into these counties and helping these individuals out. So it's really a pretty damning situation. For the overall economy, there is hope and there is despair because during any period of disruptive change, we can go in one of two directions. We rarely kind of stay kind of in the middle here. If we're able as a society to take advantage of the fact that a significant number of people are not only living longer, but they're living in better health for longer periods of time, meaning they can work for longer too, well, this gives us a bump. It's something we call the demographic dividend. And if we tap into that demographic dividend, we can have an additional tax paying base. We can have additional consumers that otherwise wouldn't exist in the economy before. If we don't tap into it, the dependency ratio, which is the number of people working versus the number of people not, either in retirement or out of work, kind of explodes all at once. And when that happens from a macroeconomic point of view, it creates a drag on the economy, an overall drag on the economy. Too many are taking, too few are putting in. When that happens, a lot of different pieces can activate at the same time. The first thing is we can't pay our bills. We can't pay for things like Social Security. We can't pay for things like Medicare and Medicaid. We can't pay to keep upkeep on our roads and our railway systems. I think that's all in everyone's mind right now. How the infrastructure is not quite where it should be. But more concerning than anything else is that our credit rating can be impacted. And this is a longer term thing. This is something that localities have been dealing with for some time now. The national government, not so much yet. But when that credit rating is hit, when you actually go down in credit rating, it becomes harder and harder to borrow, as you know. And when you can't borrow that cash, you can't build those roads. You can't build that infrastructure to attract people in. So it can turn into a real weird death spiral if you don't manage it from the onset.
How far out have these trends that we just discussed in rural communities in particular been identified? I feel like we only as a public started hearing about them in the last decade, but as you mentioned, this has been going for quite some time. Is this something that political leaders just ignored? Is it something that we just pretended wasn't happening? Does the demographic research community have you all been trying to get everyone's attention on this for some time?
Yeah, I mean, we've been very well aware of the change for a long time because it's a long term trend. Like I said, this is something that's been around since before the revolution in this country. So demographic change is here; it's always been here. The speed at which demographic transition is sped up, I think, has caught people off guard. So here's a good analogy for you. Think of industrialization as the parent. Well, industrialization had a number of children. The two children that we're paying most attention to are climate change and demographic change. For the most part, they haven't affected us for most of the history, even though they've been happening underneath the surface for a long period of time. Well, in the past 25 years, both demographic and climate change have really sped up. And now all of a sudden, they are the subjects that people pay the most attention to. It's not that we were burying our heads in the sand per se. It's just they weren't a clear and present threat to our daily way of life. Now they are. Now they are a clear and present threat to our daily way of life. And because of that, business in particular is taking the lead on addressing these changes. And government, albeit at a very slow rate, is also looking into how they can make adjustments to account for these new realities.
And how do you feel the education system has adapted to this? In recent weeks, I have seen an awful lot of headlines about the cratering of college enrollment across the country and concerns about, whether elementary schools that currently are down to very small numbers will stay open. And as we close those and consolidate, there's going to be implications for the access to education in some parts of the country. So curious about what you feel academia from the elementary level all the way up to our higher education institutions have either taken this into their planning or are looking to address it.
Um, I don't think they have addressed it, not in a meaningful way, and not in a way that really accounts for what's here and what's coming. That's scary. We apportion education across this country based on state, county, and local resources. There isn't a national education system here. So it's not like we can just snap our fingers at the federal level and make sure that everyone gets access to education. It doesn't work quite like that in the US. So obviously there are areas that are going to be disproportionately affected by demographic change. We've seen consolidation of schools now for decades. This is nothing new, especially in rural areas. Um, what schools are going to need to do, and I think this is what schools learned during COVID, is that they're going to have to move to more online learning for a lot of these kids. So the one room schoolhouse moves from that one building that houses all 12 grades to maybe a digital platform. Um, that's what the future looks like for a lot of these kids. But our whole education system is really off. It's off because it doesn't take into account the fact that we're living so long now on average. And that's highly problematic. When you think about it, we condense essentially everything you need to learn and know into the first 18 to 24 years of a person's life. Meanwhile, the average person who gets to 18 to 24 is likely going to live to about 80. 60 years of not re-educating is highly problematic. We're starting to see schools, universities in particular, go after, people who are re-educating themselves later in life, going after new degrees. That's one way that universities might stay afloat. But we also are coming to a realization rather, that a university degree isn't for everybody. The promise of a university degree came about as a universal access point through the GI Bill. And that became it was de rigueur. You went to college. College became incredibly expensive. Degrees didn't have a good return on investment anymore. And I think a lot of young men and women are looking around and seeing, folks that are pipe fitters and HVAC installers, plumbers, leaving their technical and trade schools, making six figures, and they're saying, well, wait a second, I got a degree in humanities and I can't break $40,000 a year. So it's really a mathematical equation that we have here. We are better when we have people that can build and people that can fix. And we had a gap in that skill set in this country for about 20 years or so. We're starting to slowly rebuild that as a result of, frankly, an education system that's not sustainable.
What are the factors, in your view, that play into the birth rate decline? This has been a very interesting point, and I've seen it much debated. I wouldn't say I've seen it very well academically debated. Maybe
Mhm.
some social conversations, but this is an interesting topic because I would love to get your view on whether you think this is just the natural progression of a society as it gets wealthier, as it gets more highly educated, that it's just a normal process that couples marry later, have children later, have fewer
Mhm.
of them, or are there other factors like the expense of raising children, or where you'd be raising those children, or other environmental factors that are less about the condition of the society economically, and more perhaps about the sort of social order about how we take care of kids?
Uh, that's an excellent question, and there's not a single thing that you can point to say, well, that's it. That's what caused this. Because, like I said at the onset of this conversation, birth rates have been in decline since the 1760s. In fact, there isn't a country in the world right now that isn't experiencing a decrease in birth rates. Now, there's wide variation in the number of babies that people are having nation to nation. So, the lowest birth rate in the world right now is in Korea, where they have 0.78 babies per woman. You need 2.1 babies per woman to keep a population stable. In other countries, the highest is in sub-Saharan Africa, in the country of Niger. Birth rates, the highest birth rate is 6.89 per woman. Obviously, there's a high mortality rate there too for children. But we're looking at a real kind of disconnect where babies are being born and babies aren't being born. What can we point to as the reason for this? Well, industrialization is a component of it. Shifting societal structure, moving from the farms to the factories and the cities, is another. Um, I tend to think that the single biggest contributing factor to this is education, primarily education of women, access to family planning, birth control, um, and that those two things in particular have really kind of sped all this up. When you overlay, as you suggested, when you overlay the cost of raising a child, that certainly, I think, plays into it as well. And the fact that women have the ability now to delay having kids well into their 40s or even 50s. If they wait that long, they have a shorter event horizon to have multiple children.
And then the implications for for the lower birth rate, there's a lag, right? So there's a lower birth rate today. We will realize some of the consequences of that. How many years down the road, if we started to increase the birth rate today, how many years down the road before the society as a whole would start to feel the benefits of that change, that data point?
I mean, I think comfortably you can say that change happens 18 to 20 years out, 16 to 20 years out, because those were when those individuals start coming into the labor force and can actually start turning the labor force around. So on the low end, we're talking 16 years. On the high end, we're probably talking 24. So it sits somewhere in between until we actually can realize that significant economic change and that economic bump.
So as a demographer, then is it safe to say that as we look to the future, a lot of the next, let's call it 16 to 20 years, is already baked. The children that have been born are born. Those who have not are not. There's a certain destiny now over these next, let's say, 2 decades or so that is unchangeable outside of massive global events like wars and pandemics.
Yes. So I do strategic foresight as it relates to demographics, and essentially the next generation is baked for us. So we have a very clear idea now of birth rates, death rates, voter participation rates, and what they will look like for at least the next decade, comfortably. So you think about the body politic, for example. This is always one that kind of blows people's minds because we think about boomers as kind of a fixed number of people because they had such a significant impact on American culture. Well, at their peak, boomers were 76 million people. Today, they're about 69 million people.
Hmm.
We lose about 2.5 million boomers a year. At the same time, even though Generation Z, a good number of your listeners, are a smaller generation, they're already larger than the boomers in terms of their actual size. And every year, 4 million members of Generation Z become eligible to vote in this country. Generation Z, highly liberal, highly progressive. Boomers tend to be more conservative. It's just shifting things at a pretty substantial rate. And I don't think a lot of folks were ready for this. I mean, and they certainly weren't ready for young people to participate.
And that has huge implications on all elements of society as well, including in the business community. So I'm going to shift to that in a moment. Let me
Mm,
step back to the geopolitics around the world. So we've been
sure.
focusing on the United States at this point. Let's take a little tour around the world and give me a sense of the big changes, the big headlines in demographics. So let's start in Europe. And I know we can break that down into Western and Eastern. So
Mhm.
if we need to do that, let's do it. But what are some of the big changes that European countries are facing?
So European countries are aging, and their regions have been populating faster than ours here in the U.S. They're just ahead of the curve than we are. European nations have also been better at extending human life than we have. So average life expectancies across Europe are closer to 81, whereas in the United States they're closer to 76 right now. So there's a big disparity there. European countries have been better at providing social protection to their populations. Um, but these aren't sustainable. These measures that they have in place are not sustainable. So, probably the biggest headline in the news that people should have at least heard of were the protests around France's increase of its retirement age from 62 to 64. Um, this was, a pretty seismic shift in that country that really embraces retirement as a way of life. Um, Macron, the president of France, pushed this through using a constitutional action, very undemographic process to do it, a democratic process rather to do this. But if he didn't do it, the system starts to fall apart. So we're in a point now where we probably could have been making bigger pivots or smaller pivots earlier on that it would have had less impact on people's daily lives. But we kept pushing it off. We kept pushing it off, much like we keep pushing off reforming Social Security and Medicare. When we get to that breaking point, though, there's got to be some radical change. And radical change, like you may say, Brad, 62 to 64, that doesn't seem like that's hard. But for a lot of people who are in that kind of physical work, uh, ditch diggers, manufacturers, et cetera, that actually could be a pretty significant lift, those extra 24 months. So there is some empathy that I have towards the individuals that now have to work for an extra 2 years, because some might not be able to do so in the same way they could when they were younger.
Now, let's talk about that one specifically for a moment because what struck me about the issue in France was how quickly it was proposed, pushed through, and implemented. And one of the sort of political rules of dealing with our elders has always been you don't make a sudden change. If you're going to change your retirement age, you pre-script it years in advance, you exempt the current generation from it, and it's something that you have to plan for many, many years down the road. And France just violated all of those rules, went straight for it, implemented it immediately, and obviously we saw the consequences of that. In your view, I'm sure that Mr. Macron was being advised by demographers and by economists and so forth. Was it really an emergency situation? I mean, was that action justified given the data and that the French government had simply kicked this can down the road to its ultimate end and they had no choice? Or is this something that could have actually been eased in over time?
No, I think we're already too late. We're too late here. In the next 10 years in this country, Social Security and Medicare run out of money. And without really seismic change to those programs, they just stop paying out. People won't lose their entire benefit, but you only get about 75% of it in the coming years. So maybe that's the gradual change to something new. But we've been in a long-standing period of rebalancing risk in Europe and the United States. Europe, the government had always taken a lot of risk. Here, less so. But in both regions, you're seeing that more and more risk is being put back onto the individual versus the state or the institution. I mean, I would have loved if we would started to handle this 20 years ago or 25 years ago. The last reform to Social Security in this country was during the Reagan administration. So we've been a little slow on that. And the last reform to Medicare, major reform to Medicare, was under the Bush 2 administration. So it's just like we have been kicking the can down the road. And at some point, the bow will break, not to mix too many metaphors here. But without those periodic changes that account for longevity, that account for the reality of the population mix, the demographic mix, um, the systems fall apart at some point. They have to be responsive to change. And, you tell me, this is one of those cases where there's a question of fairness, too. So when Social Security was put into place in this country in 1935, the average life expectancy for an individual, men and women, was about 50, 54, 55 years old. Retirement age was 65. Today, average life expectancy is 76 in this country. Retirement age is 65. So we haven't really accounted for the reality that most people live longer today, and we have to pay more because of it as a result.
So, do you think that throughout Europe, France may have been the first to go, but one by one, these countries are going to have to implement similar changes, at least to their retirement age, if not other social programs?
Oh, it's already happening. It's already happening in other nations. It's just a question of the speed now, and how much political will there is to make change. There is a reality, obviously, in numbers because we're dealing with a numbers game here. The coalition, if we want to call it a coalition of progressive millennials and Gen Z, outnumbers the conservatives now in most every nation in the world. Younger people, especially Gen Z, really like institutions. They tend to believe in government and believe in the role of government in our society and our economy. They want these things. They want to have good retirement security, but they know that the current system doesn't work for them and really doesn't work for anybody, if we're calling a spade here. So the question is, will the establishment allow them a seat at the table to make the adjustments that are necessary for the future of the nation? Or will the establishment and the institutions force the hand of the electorate and these young men and women burn it down and start all over again.
It's a scary prospect, but it's happened before, hasn't it?
It has happened before. And, I mean, not to pull us back to the United States, but we do have a tradition here of waiting until something breaks before we fix it. And the fact that our event horizon on a pretty significant break is I mean, I can see it in the front windshield. And I can hear the president, I can hear members of Congress, I can hear virtually every organization that represents older adults in particular saying, and the union saying, we need to strengthen Social Security. There's maybe 3 members of Congress that have actually proposed something, a plan to actually change it. And in this era of divided government, razor thin margins in the House and the Senate, the chance of any meaningful change, certainly before the 24 election, is zero. It's just zero. So we've kicked the can down the road again. It's likely we will have divided government unless there's a trouncing by either party, which I don't anticipate in 2024. We'll have to kick the can again. That means that the thing just starts falling apart, and then action will have to be taken. So, we have a choice of doing it today or when people stop getting their checks.
So speaking of where things fell apart, though I don't know that demographics played a role, but you tell me, the war in Ukraine, something that was not originally anticipated. Well, it may have been by those in the know. It was not certainly by the general population. Has shaken the core of European security and stability. Has set off a refugee crisis on top of many others around the world, and has thrust two significant countries of Eastern Europe, if we include Russia, against each other. In your view, did demographics play any role in Russia's decision to do what they did? Because we know Russia's had a demographic decline for quite some time, maybe more chronic and critical than other countries. And now that we have seen these actions take place, and now we are seeing populations move across Europe, what are some of the ripple effects that you're watching and that we all should be thinking about?
Yes, Russia, this is kind of their last big swipe for something. Russia has this idea of their empire being and looking a certain way. China is the same. This was their last best chance to recapture territory, space that they believe is theirs. It was a huge miscalculation on Putin's part. I don't think he ever anticipated that Ukrainians would fight back the way they did, or that the collective West would unite against the invasion. I think he expected another Crimea. Russia is, by every single measure, in a demographic spiral right now. The first dip happened after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s. Birth rates cratered then. Birth rates are cratering now. You also have incredible outward migration. There's Russians trying to cross the southern border into this country now. 30,000, I believe, was the last estimate from Customs and Border Patrol. You also have an older, sicker population that's been left behind, and they're seeing a reversal in their life expectancy there too. It's down to about 69 years. So a lot of bad things are happening to Russia at the same time. How much do you want to stay up at night thinking about these things? This keeps me up at night. There's only a handful of things that do, but this keeps me up at night. That without major structural reforms in Russia, without an uptick in the birth rate, without a rebalancing of the economy, without rejoining the global order, we could be looking at a failed state in 10 years, maybe sooner. Like, we're talking about change that's never happened before. And we've never had depopulation like this happening in any one nation. So you're in Dallas, Texas, around Dallas, Texas. Russia lost a population the size of Dallas, Texas just last year. Can you imagine in the United States if we wiped Dallas off the map? Like, it would be a national crisis. So for a country that's smaller than us, it is even more impactful to lose that many people to war, to COVID, to outward migration, to deaths just because of being unable to survive to a long life because of incredibly low birth rates. It's really hard for most people to comprehend. Why it keeps me up at night is because we have never lived in a world where there hasn't been a Russia. So even when Russia lost its satellite states following the Cold War, there was this kind of establishment of some democracies, and obviously some are authoritarian as well. But what happens if Russia shatters into 1,000 pieces? What happens when all of these new potential states now have control over nuclear weapons? That's the stuff that should keep people up at night. The economic stuff I'm less concerned about, mostly because Russia isn't integrated into the global economy as much as it used to be. So I don't think there'll be as much of a ripple effect when it comes to the economic order. But as it relates to geopolitical stability, yes, a lot. And that probably should keep people up at night.
And I'm curious, I mean, there has to be this conversation at the senior levels of government in Russia, regardless of how authoritarian and centralized it is. They know they're in this demographic decline. They know this war has not gone well, and yet their strategy now appears to be we're going to take as many of our young people as we possibly can find, throw them at this war. We know we're going to lose huge volumes of them, which is only going to compound that and potentially accelerate that decline. Now, I'm curious if you see any parallels between this and past wars, because Lord knows Russia was at the center of the major wars of Europe in the 20th century, lost huge volumes of their population, and survived. The Russian state in one form or another survived, and arguably after World War II was quite powerful. Do you think they're drawing the wrong lessons from history? That this is just how we fight wars, and this is what we're going to do, or is there a bigger strategy of some kind here that they just feel this is a must-win situation, and we're going to literally throw ourselves into it full bore?
Yeah, wars are a great way to distract from national problems. And in an autocratic regime, sometimes wars, especially that are, in the name of national pride or national unity, play well. I think that was the calculation: was let's make a grab. I imagine that people who are in the Russian government are considering these realities and are actually quite frightened right now. I see the data and I'm scared to death. I know leaders in our government have seen the data and are scared to death. A destabilized Russia is problematic for everyone at the end of the day. Not just for the Russian people, for the American people, for the European people, for the people across Asia and Africa as well. So I'm sure they're considering it, but it's really hard to walk back something like this, especially a war that's being fought in a very conventional manner, hand to hand on the battlefield. Right now, we're looking at the average age of a fighter in eastern Ukraine pushing upwards of 40 years old. I'm 45. I can't imagine myself anywhere near a battlefield. But we're also looking at really a war that's just kind of stuck. And unless it unsticks itself in the coming months, this spring offensive that everybody's been waiting for, it's a war of attrition. So it's just going to continue on until both sides completely tucker out.
And what are the implications on that for the countries that border, I'm gonna say specifically Ukraine, because
Mm.
we're talking about Russia, but if Ukraine is expending as many forces as they are, this clearly is going to have and has already had a big impact on their country. Is there a risk that win or lose, Ukraine becomes a failed state as well?
It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. I think the bigger question is at what point, because Russia is bigger than Ukraine. If we're looking at just the sheer numbers game here, Russia is bigger than Ukraine. The question is, if I think the bigger question for me is if Ukraine falls, Russia runs into Ukraine and takes it over, does that create a domino effect? And I'm sure that sounds, very McNamara-esque to say, For those that are unaware, McNamara was the defense secretary under Kennedy and had this idea that the dominoes would fall of communism if we didn't interject ourselves into Vietnam, which of course was 20 years of war. Will that pull other countries that sit on that border into a conflict with Russia? Yeah, it will. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about this destabilization. I'm less concerned about Ukraine becoming a failed state than a state of Russia at this point, because another government could rise up, or smaller governments could rise up in its place. But if it's the Russian government, that's a different story altogether. That pushes Russia into what is now, thanks to their involvement in Ukraine, really NATO territory. And these countries are already supporting the war effort in Ukraine. Will they support it with people next? And does this broaden out as a global conflict? We don't want to fight a war. We're not interested in fighting a war. We've been at war now we were at war for 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's not a temperature, temperature's not the right word. There's not a appetite here for going back into war. But I think supporting it as from the outside has been okay for most American people up until this point.
So let's continue our journey around the world. We're not going to make it to all the regions, but I want to touch on a couple. Asia is an enormous territory and the bulk of human population. So let's break it down into a couple of specific areas. As long as we're on the topic of land grabs and potential conflicts, we have to talk about China. We have to talk about Taiwan, and how you see them looking at themselves. First of all, we've seen the wild swings in Chinese demographics over decades, from their enormous population boom to now a population bust, to the degree that they'll no longer be the most populous country in the world soon, if that hasn't already happened. Does Taiwan play into that? Is that why it's becoming such a critical issue for them now? Does it have any implications, or does the demographic decline have any implications on accelerating their timeline, that if they're going to do something with Taiwan, they better do it soon?
Taiwan has there's a couple reasons Taiwan is interesting for the Chinese. The first is they consider to be historically part of Greater China, their empire. The second thing is that from a political standpoint, they've been pushing the narrative that they're going to take it back, that it is part of China from day one. In fact, 99.99% of governments in this world don't recognize Taiwan as an independent state. They recognize China as the primary here. But the third piece is you kind of have to take a look at how China views the world. Like, we view the world as we see the globe. The globe was designed by Europeans. So we look at the globe in one way, they look at the globe in another way. So if you just turn the globe around just slightly, you can see why Taiwan is so important to China, because in fact, it's essentially one of a barrier island of nations that surrounds their shipping lanes. If they take Taiwan, they have a clear path to U.S. territory, to the Philippines, U.S. territory in the Pacific, Hawaii, and of course the West Coast. That's part of the strategy of taking Taiwan. There's a political side of it. Yes, this is ours, woohoo. But there's also kind of a larger trade issue around taking Taiwan. There's also a larger military strategic point of view to taking Taiwan too. People don't realize how close Taiwan is to China, to mainland China. It's the equivalent of Cuba to the United States. And you think about our history with Cuba and how, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was like the world is falling apart. Well, that's kind of the way China feels about our engagement in Taiwan. It's similar to Russia's engagement with Cuba. So we have to think of it through that historic lens too. So the more we support Taiwan, the more that rattles them, the more that riles them up, and understandably so. They consider it to be their sovereign territory, even though it's acted as a free democratic society, capitalist society for decades now.
And so China itself, they must be looking at their own population, and this is a country that instituted a one-child policy and forcibly cratered their birth rate. And now it seems like they're trying to hit the reverse and get that to go in the other direction. But we've only seen something like that. I actually don't know how many times we've ever seen that in human history, where a central government of that size forcibly restricted birth rates. They're living with the consequences of that now. Again, is that baked for them? Is their population decline, terminal for the next 20 to 30 years, or do you see a stabilizing of that?
No, it's done. It's done. There's a couple of things that we can look out outside of birth rates, because the data that comes out of China isn't perfect. Data is not perfect anywhere, but data out of China, especially around births, has been kind of muddy. Everyone points to the one child policy and they say, look at this. This is what did it to China. Actually, that's not what did it to China. It sped it up. It made things that were already on one track go even faster. Chinese policies around making sure everyone was educated sped it up. China's policies around moving people to urban centers sped it up. The destruction of that traditional family structure sped it up. The fact that women are working sped it up. Like, all of these things sped it up. When we take a look at the country and we take a look at even consumer behaviors, we can see signals that suggest that the birth rates aren't turning around because people are spending money on other goods now that aren't going to kids. Things like Western luxury items like cheese and wine, sales are up. Pet ownership is up. That's suggesting that people aren't turning around. And the more people get into these things, the less, and purchasing these things, the less likely they are to have kids. China also is struggling with the fact that so many levers need to be pulled and moved on the board at the same time here. Can they turn up the birth rate? Well, no country's ever succeeded in turning up their birth rate, not in a way that's really measurable and has a long-term impact. Can they change their retirement structure? Well, believe it or not, in China, despite the life expectancy now being about 80 to 81 at birth, women who are in the manufacturing sector can retire as early as 50. I mean, that should blow your mind right there. At the same time, because they've focused on mass, this is where it comes it comes back to what happened here. Mass education of the population. Now there are too many people who are educated for the jobs that currently exist. So now you have a 16 to 24-year-olds, 1 out of 5 people unemployed. They have 1 out of 4 people. It's nearly a 25% unemployment rate. That's crazy. Like, you can't have that many young people unemployed. When you have that many young people unemployed, that creates domestic instability. And then you have all of these folks that are older that are not working either. So it's going to start pulling the country down. These are structural forces that are pulling the country's economy back. And as it tries to transition from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, it's going to struggle to do that. Especially when you see a country like India passing China this year. India, which has long been a service center, a service economy, really taking up primacy. You're starting to see some manufacturing moving into India as well. And India's population is set to continue to grow for the next 20 years or so, at least 20 years, if not 30 years. So where India will grow by 100 to 200 million people by 2050, China will see the exact reverse, 100 to 200 million people by 2050. What does it do to the overall Chinese economy? Well, I think from a top level standpoint, you don't see the Chinese economy overtaking the United States. It's just not going to happen. China's play for a reserve currency for petrol and for energy, good luck. You still need to buy all their goods in dollars today. So unless they're planning on turning everything around, that's not really going to impact the marketplace. So I think China's grasping at straws right now. I mean, I feel for them, because turning a ship of 1.4 billion people is a lot harder than turning a ship of 340 million people. But, they think they can do it. Time will tell.
2 more regions I want to touch on. Sub-Saharan Africa. I have heard and read a lot about this topic, that this is where there is still substantial population that is emerging out of poverty, emerging into some form of middle class. It offers a lot of promise for the world, and there's a huge potential that this becomes some of the young workers that Western nations and even nations of Asia are going to need. What's your view on sub-Saharan Africa's place in the world and their demographic, both challenges and opportunities?
So let's step back for a moment. So, like, when we're talking about where we're starting to see population aging and decline, we're essentially looking at the most the biggest areas for that are essentially around Russia on either side, Russia and China on either side. So we're seeing big declines in Eastern Europe. We're seeing big declines in East Asia. All population growth is essentially from sub-Saharan Africa across the subcontinent into Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's where all global population growth essentially is going to occur for the foreseeable future. In Africa, the real population explosion is happening right now. But there's also a question about resource allocation. Do they have enough resources to take care of their people? There's also a question about climate change. The most of the negative effects of climate change are actually going to hit areas like sub-Saharan Africa, the subcontinent, into Western Asia. So while, yes, there are a lot of people being born there, yes, their populations are growing at a very fast rate. The question remains, are they going to be stable? Because are there going to be enough resources there for the people they're reproducing? I can't answer that question because I'm not a climate scientist by any measure. But what I can say is that if the economies don't grow, if they keep a dependency rate that's still relatively high and a lot of people in poverty, that could spell a destabilized region. What you'll find in sub-Saharan Africa right now, and I think this should cause some pause, is that China has made incredible investments into that region. And because of that, China may have access to labor in particular that we will not have the same access to. There are more U.S. bases that exist in Africa than Chinese ones, but it's only time will tell if that remains the case. But in many respects, the fight for the future will be in sub-Saharan Africa, not in other theaters.
And let's touch on Latin America, one of the more stable geopolitical regions in the world from a military standpoint. Economically, obviously, some challenges in certain countries, and
Mm.
it's a huge space. When we're talking about everything from Mexico all the way south to the southern border of Chile and all of the Caribbean, so that's a lot to tackle. But maybe
Mhm.
from the highest level view of how you look at that region, its proximity to the United States, and some of the demographic trends and opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, the birth rates are in decline across all of Latin America from Mexico south. Um, some of the more disruptive demographic change is happening in places like Brazil. But in a country like Mexico, Mexico ends up being the big winner in all of the change that's happening right now. They have a population that's still growing. The cost of labor is relatively low. They share a border with us, and we're not planning on attacking them. It's hard to attack from the south from a geopolitical standpoint. And then they have two bodies of water on either side. So they're a relatively safe country to do business in right now. And I think we're going to see, because of the cost of labor and because of the relative safety and sphere of the United States power, that they become a major manufacturing center, not just for the U.S., but the world.
That would be a huge change for
Well,
American business.
it's just the reality is, no matter how you cut it, we got drunk off of cheap labor and cheap goods. We got drunk off them. And for, essentially since Nixon opened up China, China has been able to outcompete the rest of the world in producing things that are cheap. And we loved it. We loved it. We just adored having cheap things. That is going to come to an end. Will it be an abrupt end? No. But the cost of goods are going to change. Where goods are manufactured is also going to change. We're going to see more manufacturing coming back here to the United States, certainly as automation becomes more commonplace in factories, as we build a new infrastructure for the realities of this country. But I think COVID, there were two things that kind of put China on its heels that were not its demographics, and that was President Trump and COVID. COVID really put China on its heels because all of a sudden we were trying to get all of our stuff out of one place. And every business, every government, not just the United States, said, whoa, we can't do this. We can't survive like this if everything's coming from a single market. So we're going to see diversification of supply chains. We're going to see operations opening up in multiple markets. But if you're a rational decision maker here and you own a business that makes parts or products and services, and you're looking around, just look south to Mexico. It's a land border, so we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about ships crossing the ocean. In a period of geopolitical instability, the seas become one of the first places that become harder to manage, harder to patrol. And if China's threatening U.S. naval supremacy in the seas, that also threatens the movement of goods and services. Goods rather, not services, products and goods. So having a manufacturing center that sits in the south on the land border is actually very beneficial for the U.S. and its economy.
Two final questions. One, as you think about the next 20 years, as you said, so much of it is baked. The world's going to look different. Geopolitics will play a role in that. Demographics play a role in that. Is there a country in the world today that doesn't get a lot of attention that you think, because of its demographic advantages, will be more important if we're having this conversation in 2040 that maybe we don't talk about today? And conversely, is there a country on the map today that we all spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, but again, we'll turn the clock forward to 2040. You suspect that they'll be in a second tier of nations?
I think the first question is easier to answer than the second question. The country that we don't spend a lot of time talking about today, that we'll be talking about a lot, is Nigeria, followed quickly by, I think, Egypt. Those are probably the two countries that we're going to be talking about the most. Obviously, both African countries, both countries that have an incredibly high birth rate. But Nigeria probably the most, because Nigeria is on track to eclipse the US in terms of overall size of its population. So whenever there's a move kind of on the board, like we're making a big deal right now about India surpassing China, because we always, whenever you move from 1 to 2, everyone's going to talk. Nigeria will move from 4 to perhaps 3 in pecking order in the next 20 years or so. That will change things. That will change the way we look at that country, the way we engage with that country, and the way the world sees it. Now, which countries will fall into maybe obscurity? I think that's the suggestion here. That's tough. If we're looking purely from a birth rate standpoint, Korea is going through the most significant change right now in terms of the shrinking of its population. But as long as China stays on the map, as long as North Korea stays on the map, they remain relevant to the geopolitical order. A country that I think is certainly facing some incredible headwinds right now is Brazil. We talk about Brazil a lot now, but Brazil's population structure, its age structure, have turned around overnight. Brazil's that country of the future that never managed to get to the future. And I think because of that, and because of their own political instability, they don't reach the level that they keep promising they're going to get to time and time again over their history. I don't see them jumping up there. We'll be putting our attention to other places.
So the last question is back to the super age.
Hmm.
Once a population reaches the super age, once they have 1 in 5 over the age of 65, play out for us the best case scenario, worst case scenario of societies that get to that moment. I think we could probably extrapolate the worst case. We've actually talked about that a little bit. So maybe it's better to spend more time on the best case scenario. What does it look like in a well-managed population, well-managed country? You've reached the super age, but you're going to do the best you can to still make that a period of prosperity and relative peace.
Once we achieve super age, we should start harmonizing again. For most of human history, older adults in particular played an active role in society until their final days. Benjamin Franklin was an active diplomat until his 80s for the US government, and that was in the 1700s. Joe Biden running for president again at 80 is a symbol of this super age. In fact, he's really a super ager himself, somebody who's leagues above other people the same age in terms of his physical health, mental health, and cognitive health. What happens in the ideal situation is that we start to see people return to work. Following the Second World War, 1 out of 5 men over 65 were working. By 1990, that had dropped to 1 out of 8. Today, it's about 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5. When we get back up to 50% or higher, that's going to be really good for society because it's going to slow that. It's going to be like, as Powell says about the economy right now, we want to have a soft landing. We want to have a soft landing as we enter super age. We want to see more people engaged in the economy, more people paying taxes, more people earning, more people spending. That's what we want. So increasing older worker participation is probably the single biggest thing that I see as the best way to land the plane softly and get back to parity. We're also starting to see some states extending working opportunities to younger people too. This has kind of not really hit the national conversation yet, but in states like Arkansas, where Sarah Huckabee Sanders is governor, they've actually lowered the age in which younger people can be employed. Now, we're not talking about 14 years old going into the mines like my grandfather, but we're allowing for individuals who are younger teenagers to have part-time jobs outside of school. Because for some people, they need to earn. And we have to figure out how to build technology into all of this, improve efficiencies in the system, alleviate some of that burden, specifically around caregiving, so it becomes a bit more efficient without really losing that human touch. Because at the end of life, you don't want to be left sitting next to a machine taking care of you. If all these things come together, if birth rates even out, society goes back to the way it was. It moves away from this disruptive period of the 20th century where we had explosive populations, and we move either to slow population decline or population just starts to even out. And we go back to the historical standard, which existed for 300,000 years since humans have walked this planet, 10,000 years of human society, where we grow very slowly. There will be adjustments that have to be made during this period. In fact, our relentless pursuit of GDP growth is one of those things that we have to reconsider. We have to look at other measures for societal success that aren't just about making money. Saving the planet, making sure people are healthy, making sure people are fed and have roofs over their heads. That becomes a greater goal for us. So that's the ideal way that we get to super age and manage super age, because if we do, we'll be living in a more just and more equitable world.
You've given us a lot to consider today, and I appreciate it. The book is The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. It's still available widely. I've seen it on your website, thesuperage.com. If people would like to learn more about you, Bradley, or about the book, or about some of what we've talked about today, what's the best way for them to find you or get in touch with you?
Easiest way is to email me if you want to get to me directly at bradley@thesuperage.com. Also, if you want to connect on socials, it's at Bradley Schurman on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Bradley Schurman, that's SCHURMAN.
Excellent. And we will post the links to those social media sites as well as to your website and your book in the description of this podcast, as well as on my website, brianjmatos.com. Bradley Schurman, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be with you.
As with so many of the programs that we do, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that one again. There was a lot of information and a lot of important findings from that interview that I think are worth taking a second, third, fourth listen to, which is easy to do, of course, if you are subscribed to the program on your favorite podcast aggregator. You can listen to our show anytime and as many times as you want. You can also visit my website, brianjmatos.com, to download these episodes and take them with you anywhere that you want to go. You can reach out to us if you have questions or clarifications or want to opine about what you heard today. The most direct way to reach me is info at brianjmatos.com. You can find me on Twitter at brianjmatos, also on Facebook where we post clips. It's brian.matos, and we also have a Facebook page that's live now that you can subscribe to, and we'll be posting episode clips there. And speaking of episode clips, we'll be posting those to our YouTube channel at Brian J. Matos Podcast if you want to find it directly. But otherwise, you can just go to YouTube and search for Brian J. Matos or the names of any of my guests that we have talked with, and we'll have clips of those interviews available so that you can preview the shows and take them with you again anywhere that you want to go. Quick note on upcoming programs. Next week, we will have Lisa Patel. She is the CEO of Istesso, and we're going to be talking about autoimmune disease and cancer and the great, exciting developments in treatments for autoimmune diseases. And Lisa has been on the cutting edge of some of those, been traveling a lot and doing some great speaking sessions. So she'll be coming off of that circuit for a little while and joining us to talk about that element of healthcare. And then in 2 weeks, Lucy Jung will be joining us. She's the co-founder of Charco, a medical innovation device company focused on Parkinson's disease and degenerative diseases of all sorts. So we're going to be talking medical the next couple of weeks with Lisa Patel and Lucy Jung. We look forward to those programs, and I hope that you will join us for those. In the meantime, thank you for joining us again this week, and as always, stay curious.